A millionaire hired a humble cleaning lady to clean his mansion. That same day, he arrived home early and was stunned to see what she had done to his 7-year-old son. The first ray of sunlight came through the window of the small apartment, softly illuminating Elizabeth's face as she prepared breakfast. The aroma of freshly toasted bread and fresh coffee filled the air, filling the room with a cozy feeling. Daniel, her 8-year-old son, appeared in the kitchen, still with sleepy eyes, but with a smile that soon lit up his face. "Good morning, Mom," he said, rubbing his eyes gently. Elizabeth smiled, feeling a warmth in her chest. Every morning woke up early. Every day of exhausting work was worth it for that smile. It was to him that he dedicated all his strength, all his effort, without ever thinking about giving up. She wanted to give Daniel the future he deserved, and nothing would stop her. After coffee, it was time to say goodbye. With a tender kiss on her son's forehead, Elizabeth accompanied him to school. With a gesture, he saw Daniel walk away. He waved, and she turned around, ready to face another long day of work. My heart beat a little faster than normal, not only because of the farewell, but because of the expectation. That day, I would start a new job. The new opportunity was at the home of Alexander Montero, a businessman known for his success, but also for his coldness. Working in a mansion like that was a chance that would help a lot with the family's finances. Still, Elizabeth had her concerns. The simple life she was used to seemed incompatible with the luxurious and distant world she was about to discover. When he arrived at the imposing gate, a knot tightened his stomach. The mansion was grand, with huge windows and impeccably manicured gardens, looking like something out of a fairy tale. She took a deep breath, adjusted her bag on her shoulder, and decided to move on. Upon entering, everything looked bright. Crystal chandeliers illuminated every detail of the decoration, which exuded luxury, but also a strange feeling of emptiness. Perfection was everywhere, but something essential was missing, something that not all the money in the world could buy. In silence, he began his tasks, trying to get used to the environment. As she cleaned the room's large windows, she noticed a pair of eyes watching her. It was a child, with a curious but, at the same time, cautious look. The boy was half hidden, as if he were a shy visitor in his own home. Elizabeth smiled gently, but he only stared at her for a few seconds before hiding behind the wall. That brief exchange of glances was enough for Elizabeth to know that it was Benjamin, Alexander's son. A pang took his heart when he saw that lonely expression. Something about that child seemed so familiar. Maybe the way his eyes searched for something he didn't even know where to find. Later that day, Elizabeth had her first meeting with Benjamin's father. Alexander Montero appeared suddenly, like a presence that seemed to fill the room with a calculated coldness. He was a tall man with a serious posture, and his expression conveyed the same ice that was felt in the house. Bluntly, he greeted her with few words. The direct and rigid way of communicating left no doubt. Alexander was the type of person who did not tolerate distractions. "The job is simple," he said, without looking directly at her but with a heavy look in his eyes. "Keep your house in order and avoid distractions. I value professionalism." Elizabeth nodded respectfully, maintaining a calm tone. Alexander left the room without saying anything else, making it clear that there would be no room for any unnecessary proximity or conversation. He believed that the structure and money he provided for his family were enough. For him, the distance between employer and employee was necessary, and any interaction beyond the essential seemed like a waste of time. Elizabeth focused on her tasks throughout the day, trying to adjust to her new routine. At the end of the afternoon, getting ready to leave, he noticed Benjamin's presence again. The boy was behind a column, observing her with the same attentive and curious gaze. This time, Elizabeth approached carefully, avoiding scaring him. "Hello, Benjamin, right?" she said with a gentle smile. The boy hesitated, but then nodded slightly, without looking away. There was an unexpected depth in those eyes, something that reflected a loneliness he shouldn't have known at such a young age. "I'm Elizabeth, the new employee. Nice to meet you," she continued, keeping her voice soft. "Do you like to play?" The question, asked with rare sincerity, surprised Benjamin. He seemed to ponder for a moment before responding, almost whispering, "I like it, but no one plays with me here." Elizabeth's heart sank when she heard this. Without thinking twice, he let out a light laugh and took a coin out of his pocket. "Do you know how to play heads or tails?" he asked, showing the coin between his fingers. Benjamin nodded, intrigued, and the two were distracted by the simple game. They laughed together, exchanging curious glances. For a few minutes, the cold and distant mansion seemed more welcoming, illuminated by Benjamin's laughter. When she realized that time had passed and she needed to go, Elizabeth said goodbye with a smile. "Tomorrow we'll play again, if you want," he promised. Benjamin watched her leave, with a look that mixed hope and curiosity. As she left the mansion, Elizabeth reflected on the difference between her life and Alexander's, but the image of Benjamin, so lonely, remained in her mind. In the following days, Benjamin started looking for Elizabeth, always appearing in the areas where she was. Every little break she managed to take, she dedicated a few minutes to the boy. They created simple rituals. They told funny stories, made faces, and Elizabeth even taught him some jokes and games. Benjamin, who had always lived surrounded by nannies and governesses, felt something different around her. Elizabeth was not like the other people in the mansion. She smiled a lot, looked at him with genuine affection, like a friend, or maybe something more, he thought, without knowing how to define it. "Want to see a magic trick?" Elizabeth asked one day, with a mischievous smile. He took a coin out of his pocket and pretended to make it disappear in his hands. Benjamin watched with his eyes wide open, torn between surprise and laughter, when the magic coin appeared behind his ear. Every little trick Elizabeth did was like a gift to him, a moment of pure happiness, free from the coldness and formality of the life he was used to. As the days went by, this special relationship did not go unnoticed by the other employees of the mansion. The housekeeper, upon noticing Benjamin happier and more playful, couldn't help but comment to another employee. "Have you seen how the boy has been around lately?" she murmured. "I've never seen him so excited." Another employee replied, even more quietly, "And it looks like it has something to do with the new employee." Whispers began to circulate, raising suspicions about Elizabeth's intentions in getting closer to the boy. Was she trying something? But Elizabeth didn't care about the gossip. For her, those moments with Benjamin were precious, a chance to bring some joy into his life, to ease the loneliness the child clearly felt. In Benjamin, she saw a reflection of her own son, Daniel, and silently promised herself that she would never let Benjamin feel abandoned while she was around. Alexander, always immersed in his endless activities, barely noticed what was happening around him. He vaguely noticed that his son was happier, but he attributed it to some new toy he had bought. In a brief conversation with the housekeeper, he heard that Benjamin was becoming more lively. "Ah, he's calmer. Finally getting used to the house," she said. Alexander, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt, paid no more attention. "Good," he replied absently, leaving for another day of work, without realizing that his son's happiness had nothing to do with expensive toys, but rather with Elizabeth's warm presence. One night, Alexander arrived early, exhausted. As he crossed the hallway, he heard contagious laughter coming from the room. He stopped, confused, and stood there for a few moments, feeling a discomfort he couldn't understand. That sound was not common. Laughter was not part of the atmosphere in that house. Curious, he approached the half-open door and peeked. Benjamin was sitting on the floor laughing, while Elizabeth made the sound of an owl and imitated his movements. Alexander felt a strange pang in his chest. It was as if something that should have always been there, but that he had never noticed, was now before his eyes. Not wanting to interrupt, he walked away, the sound of his son's laughter still echoing in his mind. Even after returning to work, that scene disturbed him the entire night. He didn't know why, but the sight of Benjamin so happy bothered him. Something seemed out of place, something he couldn't name. Meanwhile, Elizabeth continued to be a secret friend to the boy. She knew those moments were ephemeral, a fleeting spark in a life that would soon resume its usual course. But every smile she managed to get from Benjamin was a gift, and the sparkle in his eyes filled her with satisfaction. Work, which previously meant just a way to earn a living, now had a new purpose. The simple moments they shared had immense value. The cold and empty mansion gained warmth with their jokes and laughter. And, unexpectedly, this closeness not only brightened Benjamin's life, but also filled something inside Elizabeth. For her, being there was like rediscovering a maternal love that went beyond blood ties. It was genuine care, which overflowed without the need for explanation. One unexpected afternoon, Alexander decided to return to the mansion early. It wasn't something he used to do, but a sudden urge led him to want to be present and perhaps try to connect more with Benjamin. Alexander always justified himself, saying that he worked so hard to ensure a safe and comfortable future for his son. But lately, Benjamin's laughter with Elizabeth haunted his mind, making him restless. As he passed through the hallway, Alexander heard those laughs again that seemed to transform the atmosphere of the mansion. He followed the sound to the living room and stopped astonished when he witnessed the scene. There was Benjamin, completely absorbed in a game with Elizabeth, who was holding a doll and making funny voices. Benjamin's laughs were sincere and contagious, so intense that he almost doubled over with laughter. His eyes shone with a happiness that Alexander had never seen before, a pure joy, alien to all the luxury and formality that filled that house. Alexander stood still, watching from afar as a wave of confusing emotions washed over him. He felt a growing discomfort, a mixture of inadequacy and a strange envy. It seemed that this simple maid, with her warm smile and humble gestures, was able to offer Benjamin something that he, with all his money and power, had never been able to provide: genuine happiness. The next thing he knew, his fists were clenched, and he was breathing deeply, trying to control the feeling of incapacity he had never experienced before. The moment was interrupted when Elizabeth noticed his presence at the door. She straightened up immediately with an expression of surprise and nervousness. Benjamin, still laughing, ran to his father. "Father, you came back early," exclaimed the boy, full of enthusiasm. Alexander nodded, trying hard to hide his tension. "I'm back," he replied, casting a brief analytical glance at Elizabeth, who remained serious but respectful. After a few seconds of uncomfortable silence, Elizabeth mumbled a quick apology and left, leaving Alexander alone with his son. Alexander observed Benjamin, who was now calmer, and noticed how the shine in his eyes began to slowly disappear. He felt deeply disconcerted, as if Elizabeth's absence drained the joy from the place. That night, distraught, Alexander went to the housekeeper and asked directly, "During all this time, has Benjamin been spending a lot of time with the housekeeper?" The housekeeper hesitantly replied, "Yes, sir. They get along very well. Donna Elizabeth has been very affectionate with him, and it seems that this has done him good. The boy has been happier lately." Alexander remained silent, taking in those words. It was evident that Elizabeth's presence was impacting her son's life in ways he could no longer ignore. But this reality bothered him deeply. Determined to better understand what was happening, Alexander began to pay more attention to the household's routine. He observed Elizabeth's interactions with Benjamin, noticing how the boy's energy transformed whenever Elizabeth was around. In the days that followed, Alexander couldn't help but watch from afar. He saw how Benjamin seemed to radiate a new happiness whenever he was with Elizabeth. Each moment shared between the two seemed to bring a different sparkle to his son's eyes, something he had never noticed before. Every time Benjamin was with Elizabeth, Alexander noticed the way the boy looked at her, full of admiration. It was as if she was the only person capable of understanding his deepest needs in a way that no one else could. This discovery made Alexander uneasy. I didn't know how to process this new dynamic. Benjamin's every laugh, every gesture of joy he showed at Elizabeth's side was a reminder that perhaps the role he had always imagined having in his son's life was not exactly what he believed. Alexander began to feel intrigued. Elizabeth's presence was a mystery. There was something admirable about her, something that moved him. The simplicity with which he took care of Benjamin seemed to disarm him, making him question his own certainties. Her world had always been made of transactions, profits, and people with ulterior motives, but Elizabeth seemed to have none of that. It offered something no money could buy: genuine, selfless care. On impulse, Alexander decided to talk to Elizabeth. He went to the kitchen where she was finishing putting away the dishes. Upon seeing him there, Elizabeth stopped immediately, surprised by his presence in a place where he almost never appeared. Alexander tried to begin, his voice sounding a little hesitant. "It seems like you've been spending a lot of time with my son," he commented, trying to maintain his composure. Elizabeth nodded, always with a respectful tone. "Yes, Mr. Alexander, I noticed he was lonely a lot and I just wanted to cheer him up a little." Alexander was silent, the words stuck in his mind. He wanted to understand, but he didn't know exactly how to express his doubts. Something stopped him from accusing her of anything negative. Instead, a desire to understand emerged. "Why do you do this?" Alexander asked, his voice filled with a seriousness that tried to hide his own vulnerability. Elizabeth looked at him with a calmness that disconcerted him. "Because he's just a kid, sir. And every child deserves to have someone who really cares, someone who really smiles. I'm just trying to help." Elizabeth's sincerity caused Alexander to look away. There was no pretense in his words, no ulterior motives, just the simple truth from someone who truly cared. Alexander remained silent, as if he had lost what to say. Elizabeth, noticing his discomfort, preferred not to insist. She moved away, respecting the space he seemed to need. Over the next few days, Alexander continued to watch her from afar. He felt uncomfortable, but also fascinated. He couldn't understand how someone like Elizabeth, without luxuries or great ambitions, could be so valuable to her son. Deep down, Alexander didn't know how to deal with his growing frustration. It was difficult to accept that Benjamin's happiness seemed to depend more on the attention of a houseworker than on all the comfort that he, as a father, could provide. This internal conflict made him tense, even though it was already impossible to ignore the seed of doubt planted in his mind. Elizabeth's presence was, in some way, changing his life and that of his son. Although it was painful to admit, a small part of Alexander yearned to understand what made this woman so special. In the following days, concern about Elizabeth's influence on Benjamin only increased. Alexander initially tried to ignore the admiration he was beginning to feel for her and the positive impact she was having on his son. He thought that if he turned his attention to work, everything would go back to normal. But that wasn't what happened. Benjamin's joy was too visible to ignore, and Alexander found himself increasingly uncomfortable. This discomfort soon turned into something darker. Every smile on Benjamin's face, every unexpected laugh, made Alexander feel a hint of distrust. He began to wonder if Elizabeth was taking advantage of their proximity. Could it be that she manipulated her son's affection to benefit herself in some way? After all, the world Alexander belonged to was full of people who tried to take advantage of his position and wealth. Pride and distrust took over his mind, creating scenarios that had little to do with reality. On a day when his patience and jealousy ran out, Alexander decided to confront Elizabeth. He found her in the living room where she was organizing Benjamin's toys after an afternoon of playing. With a cold look and a rigid posture, Alexander crossed his arms and watched her without hiding his dissatisfaction. "Elizabeth, can we talk?" he said with a serious and almost hostile tone. Elizabeth, surprised by his presence and aggressive tone, stood up immediately, straightening herself quickly. "Mr. Alexander, did something happen?" Alexander took a deep breath, feeling an anger that he himself didn't quite understand. "I have observed your closeness to my son," he began, his voice hesitant enough that his discomfort was evident. "And I must say that this familiarity is becoming inappropriate." She tried to process what he was implying. "Sir, I just wanted to make Benjamin feel less alone," he replied calmly. "He is a very sweet boy and seems to enjoy my company." But Alexander was not willing to accept this explanation. His eyes narrowed, full of judgment. "And why do you think you can interfere in his life like that?" he continued, his voice more bitter.
Before we continue, I need to tell you something amazing. Do you want to attract a lot of money into your life? Learn how to do it with the secret content that I will leave in the first pinned comment, and start transforming your financial life. Let's continue.
"Do you think I don't understand what you're doing? Gaining his trust to take advantage, trying to secure a place in this house?" His tone was like a storm, full of distrust and contempt. Elizabeth stood still, feeling a mixture of sadness and indignation. It had never crossed his mind to take any advantage of that situation. "Mr. Alexander," he said in a firm voice, although his face showed the sadness he felt, "I never had any other intention than to take care of Benjamin and try to cheer him up a little. I never wanted, not for a second, to take advantage of anything." Alexander looked away, but the silence didn't ease the tension in the air. The accusations that hovered between them remained powerful and unshakable. Elizabeth realized that no matter what she said, it would be useless. Alexander's pride and paranoia blinded him to the sincerity of his words. She took a deep breath and declared, "If that's what you think, I see no reason to stay here. I will resign." The voice was firm, but the gleam of disappointment in his eyes didn't go unnoticed by Alexander. Without waiting for a response, Elizabeth left. I needed a moment to process the pain in silence. He gathered his few belongings and, with a heavy heart, walked through the halls of the mansion. The feeling of leaving something important behind suffocated her, but her integrity was too valuable to sacrifice. Before leaving, I knew I needed to say goodbye to Benjamin. He found the boy in the garden, distracted by his games. When he saw her, he ran towards her with a smile. His face, however, became confused when he realized her seriousness. "Aunt Elizabeth, are you leaving?" he asked, looking at the bag hanging on her shoulder. Elizabeth knelt down at the boy's level, feeling the weight of the words she needed to say. "I didn't want to see him suffer, but I also couldn't lie." "I have to go, Benjamin," he explained tenderly. "But I want you to know that I love spending this time with you. You are a special and amazing boy. I hope you keep smiling, darling." Benjamin hugged her tightly, as if he wanted to stop her from leaving. A tear ran down Elizabeth's face as she stroked the child's hair. The pain in her eyes was evident, but she tried hard to keep her voice soft. "Are you coming back, Aunt Elizabeth?" "Just for a short while," he whispered hopefully. Elizabeth hesitated, not knowing how to respond, and hugged him even tighter. When he finally pulled away, her heart was in pieces. Leaving there was one of the hardest things he ever did, but the dignity and integrity he carried was so important. Alexander found Benjamin some time later. He immediately noticed the devastating impact of Elizabeth's absence on the boy, who had previously been overflowing with joy and now seemed emptied. Benjamin was curled up, silent, with his gaze lost. Trying to cheer him up, Alexander approached. "How about we do something together, son? We can go somewhere you like." But Benjamin didn't react. His eyes fixed on the ground ignored his father's presence. Alexander wanted to believe that Elizabeth's absence would be temporary and that Benjamin would overcome the pain. But the void she left only grew as the days went by. The mansion, once full of contagious laughter, was now marked by a desolate silence. Benjamin refused to play, he didn't talk to his nannies, and even his meals had lost their flavor. The lack of life in the boy made Alexander's heart begin to feel heavy. The cold atmosphere of the mansion became suffocating. Alexander realized that Elizabeth's departure had taken with it the essence that kept that place alive. He tried to convince himself that it was enough to fill the void, but Benjamin wouldn't even look at him. Reality began to set in. His decision had left a deep mark on his son's heart, a mark that he might never be able to erase. The mansion had returned to being a lonely place, just a shadow of what it had been in happy times with Elizabeth. Since his departure, the change in Benjamin has become evident. The boy, who had previously radiated contagious joy, now wandered around the house like a shadow, with his head bowed and silent. The toys, previously scattered and used constantly, remained intact in the corners of the rooms. The laughter that once echoed through the corridors had disappeared, and the little vivacity that remained seemed to fade more and more every day. Alexander initially tried to minimize what he saw as Benjamin's adaptation phase. He believed that his son would soon overcome Elizabeth's absence and return to his usual behavior. Thus, he resorted to strategies that he considered infallible. He bought new toys, offered tours, and even considered a trip to exotic destinations. He was convinced that these gestures would be enough to cheer the boy up, but each of them failed frustratingly. "Look, Benjamin," Alexander said one day, showing off a new remote-controlled car, trying to sound confident. "How about we play with this together?" Benjamin, however, barely looked at the toy. He just shook his head gently and whispered, barely audible, "I don't want to, Daddy." The boy started to reject even the nannies, preferring to stay locked in his room for hours, in silence. At night, Alexander noticed the light on under Benjamin's bedroom door, indicating that his son, even after going to bed, was unable to sleep. The few times he saw him, Benjamin was sitting on the bed, holding some simple toy that Elizabeth had given him, or looking out the window as if waiting for something or someone who would never return. The days became cold and silent, and Alexander began to feel restless. Elizabeth's absence was more noticeable than she cared to admit. The void she had left was not something toys or gifts could fill. Alexander tried to talk to Benjamin, but the boy remained closed, immersed in a sadness that his father could not understand. Each day that passed led Alexander to reflect on his last conversation with Elizabeth. He remembered how he had accused her, dominated by a blind distrust that made him doubt her integrity. Now seeing the devastating effect his decision will have on his son, he begins to question his actions. Had I made a mistake? Was it unfair to accuse her like that? Doubts tormented him, but pride still prevented him from fully admitting his mistake. One night, while observing Benjamin sleeping, Alexander noticed that the boy was muttering something while dreaming. He approached, and between the disjointed words, he heard Benjamin whisper, "Aunt Elizabeth." Alexander felt a lump tighten in his throat. There was the proof. Despite all his attempts, nothing could replace Elizabeth's presence. Finally, he began to realize that perhaps she was the only one capable of providing her son with the happiness that he himself had never been able to offer. This understanding divided him. On the one hand, Alexander felt the weight of pride and the need to justify himself. After all, he still saw himself as an irreplaceable provider. On the other hand, the sadness on Benjamin's face tormented him deeply. Day after day, the harsh words Alexander had spoken to Elizabeth echoed in her mind. He remembered the way he treated her, accusing her of intentions that deep down he knew were nothing more than unfounded suspicions. Even though a part of his heart knew it had been unfair, admitting it was something he had never been able to fully do. But over time, the void left by Elizabeth became increasingly unbearable, like an invisible presence that haunted every corner of the mansion. Alexander spent sleepless nights, remembering every detail of the moments with Benjamin, the laughter, the small moments of joy that he now understood to be genuine. Elizabeth's figure seemed to be present everywhere, like a persistent echo of the happiness she had brought. The pride that kept him from admitting his mistake began to disintegrate, and Alexander began to understand the magnitude of the damage he had done, not only to his son's heart, but to his own as well. An afternoon that seemed like any other for Benjamin would become a milestone. The boy was consumed by Elizabeth's absence, not understanding why she didn't return or why she left him so alone. In his childish mind, the only solution that made sense was to find her and bring her back, because she was the only one who could brighten his days and make him feel the warmth of true love. When the mansion was momentarily unattended, Benjamin impulsively filled a backpack with some belongings and clumsily walked out the gates. Without a certain destination, he wandered the city streets, murmuring Elizabeth's name with hope. His small eyes sparkled, believing that at any moment she would appear, opening her arms to him. As day turned to night, Benjamin continued his search, moving further and further away from home. The streets became unfamiliar, and he soon found himself lost, tired, and disoriented. At a busy intersection, the lights of cars and the sound of horns enveloped him. The deafening sound was the last thing he heard before everything went dark. The news came to the mansion as a shock. Alexander received the call from the police and could barely process the words. Accident, hospital, critical condition. Each word felt like a dagger piercing him, plunging him into an abyss of guilt and despair. He knew, even without having details, what led Benjamin to run away from home. He understood that this desperate search was a reflection of his own arrogance, of his impulsive decision to send Elizabeth away. Alexander rushed to the hospital, his heart crushed with guilt. He could only imagine Benjamin, fragile and injured, calling out to someone he himself had pushed away. When he finally arrived, he found his son lying in a hospital bed, unconscious, his face and arms covered in bandages. Benjamin looked so small, so vulnerable in the cold light of the room. Alexander approached slowly, holding his son's hand gently. The silence was broken only by the sound of the heart monitor, until a faint whisper escaped Benjamin's lips. "Aunt Elizabeth. I love Aunt Elizabeth." Those words pierced Alexander like a blade. The tears he had always avoided showing ran freely down his face. Benjamin's suffering finally revealed the whole truth that Alexander tried to deny. He had taken from his son the only source of genuine love and affection he knew, Elizabeth. Driven by new determination, his hands shaking with guilt and hopelessness, Alexander picked up the phone and dialed Elizabeth's number. His voice was hoarse, filled with emotion and regret. "Elizabeth, I forgive myself for everything I said. I began to struggle to continue. Benjamin had an accident. He needs you. Please, I beg you," said Alexander, with a plea that touched Elizabeth's heart deeply. She knew how much she had suffered when she was taken away, but the love she felt for Benjamin was stronger than any resentment. "I'm going to the hospital," she replied without hesitation and immediately prepared to leave. When Elizabeth arrived at the hospital, she found Alexander sitting in the waiting room, his face pale and haggard. He looked up, and for an instant, she saw all the vulnerability and regret reflected in every line of his face. Without hiding his emotion, Alexander approached. "I was wrong. I was terribly wrong. You are the only person he wants. And I can't make up for what I did, but please just help him," he said, his voice cracking with pain. Elizabeth nodded, speechless, and followed him to the room where Benjamin was. Seeing him lying there, calm, with a serene face, a deep pain invaded his chest. She walked over, took his hand tenderly and whispered, "I'm here, my love. Aunt Elizabeth is here." Elizabeth's soft and familiar voice seemed to calm the child who, even unconscious, lightly squeezed her fingers as if recognizing the presence he craved. Outside, Alexander watched the scene, a whirlwind of emotions mixing inside him. Relief when he saw that Elizabeth's presence calmed his son, and a deep sadness when he realized that, as a father, he had not been enough to console Benjamin at that delicate moment. Elizabeth remained at Benjamin's side throughout the night, watching him sleep, stroking his forehead and murmuring words of comfort. Alexander walked away, giving them the privacy that seemed the most natural thing to do. As he walked through the hospital corridors, the magnitude of his mistake became increasingly evident. The next morning, when Benjamin finally opened his eyes and saw Elizabeth by his side, a smile of happiness and peace appeared on his face. He hugged her with what little strength he had, and she wrapped her arms around him, with tears in her eyes. "I knew you would come, Aunt Elizabeth," he whispered, his smile weak and his voice still fragile. Alexander watched the scene with a heavy heart, realizing that he had never been able to provoke this kind of joy in his son. The bond between Benjamin and Elizabeth was something he didn't fully understand, but he knew it was ultimately priceless. After months of arrogance and blindness, he now understood that Elizabeth was not only part of Benjamin's life, but was essential to his happiness. From that moment on, Alexander decided to change. Not just for your child, but for yourself. Elizabeth's presence not only brought comfort to Benjamin, but also ignited a spark in him. He began to understand that true wealth lay in human connections, love and genuine dedication that he had never known how to give. Over the next few days, as Benjamin recovered in the hospital, Elizabeth remained by his side. Alexander, with a mixture of gratitude and humility, began to get closer to Elizabeth. One day, while she was distracting Benjamin with a story, Alexander entered the room with a tray of food. Even though there was still some discomfort in his posture, his face showed a vulnerability he had never shown before. "I thought you might need something to eat," he said, placing the tray next to Elizabeth. She looked at him, thanked him silently and nodded. Alexander remained there, watching carefully as Elizabeth cared for Benjamin with a tenderness that reminded him of everything he had always sought in vain to give his son, a loving home. Later, when Benjamin was already asleep, Alexander found an opportunity to talk to Elizabeth. His voice was low, almost shy, and the words came out with difficulty but filled with genuine regret. "Elizabeth, I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done," he began, looking at her with a serious look. "Not only for Benjamin, but you taught me so much more than I could ever explain." He paused, took a deep breath and continued, "I was an idiot. I judged you and treated you in a way that I don't even know how to forgive. And yet, here you are, helping my son when he needs you most. I have no excuses, but I want you to know that I'm sorry." Elizabeth remained silent for a moment, watching him closely. She knew that Alexander was not someone who often acknowledged his mistakes, so the sincerity in his words touched her deeply. However, she also knew that words were not enough. What mattered now were the actions. "What matters now is Benjamin," she replied calmly, but with a firm tone. "He needs both of us to help him. But if you really want to make things right, you're going to need to show it with actions, not just words." Alexander nodded, taking in the depth of what she said. Those words marked a turning point in his life and in his relationship with Elizabeth. He knew that from that moment on, he would have to really dedicate himself to changing. In the days that followed, Alexander struggled to be present. Not just physically, but emotionally too. He began to care for Benjamin in ways that previously seemed strange to him. Reading stories, helping him eat, and most importantly, listening to his son carefully. Elizabeth, in turn, remained a pillar of support. But little by little, she noticed small but significant changes in Alexander. The way he interacted with Benjamin became more warm and genuine. This gave her a new perspective on him. When Benjamin was finally discharged and returned to the mansion, the atmosphere was different. Alexander no longer wanted the house to be a cold, impersonal place. With Elizabeth's help, he began to transform it into a home. Benjamin had the freedom to decorate his room however he wanted, and Alexander eliminated some strict rules that had previously seemed unbreakable. Furthermore, he began to spend more time at Elizabeth's house, seeking her company and advice. Alexander's co-workers at the mansion noticed the change. He was no longer the distant and authoritarian man he had been before. Now he tried to listen to others, valued everyone's presence, and began to show signs of affection, even if in a subtle way. One night, during dinner with Benjamin, Alexander did something unexpected. He stood up, raised his glass, and with a shy but sincere smile said, "Family and new beginnings." Elizabeth felt an unexpected warmth in her chest. It was the first time he had referred to them as a family, and although he hadn't said it outright, she knew those words had a deep meaning. Over time, Alexander and Elizabeth began to share more moments outside of the role of caregiver and helper. Conversations extended beyond everyday issues, and simple laughs became more common among them. Without realizing it, their hearts began to grow closer in a way neither of them had planned. Alexander, who always believed that his life was complete with professional success, discovered in Elizabeth a companion who challenged and inspired him. Elizabeth, in turn, found in Alexander a man who, although imperfect, was willing to change for love. Finally, on a walk in the garden with Benjamin, Alexander stopped, took Elizabeth's hand, and looking into her eyes, said, "Elizabeth, I know I've made a lot of mistakes, but I also know that I want you to be a part of my life. Not just as someone who cares for Benjamin, but as someone I want to share my life with. Would you be willing to give me the opportunity to show you that I can be the man you deserve?" Elizabeth, surprised but moved, looked at him. In his eyes, she saw the sincerity she had always expected. While I knew their story began under difficult circumstances, I also knew that what they had now was real, something worth trying. "Yes," she replied, with a smile that lit up Alexander's face. "But with one condition, we must always put Benjamin first and never forget what really matters." The history of Alexander, Elizabeth, and Benjamin was marked by profound and significant changes. First of all, Alexander's mansion was an empty, heatless place. But that began to change when Elizabeth entered their lives. She was more than a caretaker for Benjamin. She became the bridge that helped Alexander rediscover the connection with his son that he had never known how to cultivate. Benjamin, in turn, began to understand the true meaning of family. Over time, the relationship between Alexander and Elizabeth blossomed in unexpected ways. What started as a helping relationship turned into genuine companionship. The mansion, which previously reflected only coldness and detachment, became a home full of love, laughter, and small moments of happiness. It was as if the house had been renewed along with the feelings of those who lived there. Benjamin, who once lived in solitude, now watched his father and Aunt Elizabeth work together to build something new, something real. He felt the change in his heart, even without understanding all the words that circulated around him. Elizabeth, with her patience and affection, helped Alexander be the father he always knew he could be, but never knew how. One quiet evening, as the family ate dinner, Benjamin approached his father and with a shy smile asked, "Aunt Elizabeth, can you be my mother one day?" The question took Alexander by surprise, but it also touched him deeply. He looked at his son, then at Elizabeth, who was watching the scene with a mix of emotion and surprise. "It depends, my son," Alexander replied, holding Benjamin's hand, "but I can tell you that I'm doing everything I can to make that happen." Benjamin's smile was instantaneous, and he hugged his father, feeling a happiness he couldn't explain. That conversation made it clear to everyone that Alexander and Benjamin were ready to see Elizabeth as more than a friend or caretaker. She was now part of their lives, their future. Months later, Alexander decided it was time to formally express his feelings. He organized a simple but meaningful dinner in the mansion's garden, lit with soft lights and flowers that both Elizabeth and Benjamin appreciated. The setting perfectly reflected what Elizabeth brought to their lives: love, simplicity, and beauty. When dinner came to an end, Alexander stood up, with Benjamin by his side, and took Elizabeth's hand. "Since you came into our lives, everything has changed," he began, his voice breaking. "You brought joy to my son and taught me how to be a better father. I can't imagine a future without you." At that moment, Alexander knelt down, holding a small box with a ring, which he had chosen with Benjamin's help. "Elizabeth, will you marry me and officially become part of our family?" Elizabeth, surprised and moved, looked at Alexander and then at Benjamin, who was smiling hopefully. Speechless, she nodded with an emotional yes. Tears began to fall from her eyes as she hugged them both, sealing the commitment that from the beginning had already been in their hearts. The wedding took place in an intimate way, surrounded only by close friends and some employees of the mansion, which now felt like a real family. Elizabeth looked radiant, and Alexander, for the first time in his life, felt that he had found something more valuable than any professional achievement. The love and happiness he had always sought, but now knew were within his reach. After the wedding, Elizabeth and her son Daniel officially moved into the mansion. Benjamin and Daniel, who had already become great friends, now lived together in an environment where friendship and love thrived. Together, they celebrated their new life, creating memories and building a solid and happy family. Life in Alexander's mansion became completely different. He made an important decision. He reduced his work commitments so he could dedicate more time to his family. Dinners together, walks in the park, and afternoons playing in the garden became a routine that filled the house with laughter and joy. The relationship between Alexander and Daniel, his son, blossomed in ways he never imagined. He became a loving and present father figure, not only to Daniel, but also to Benjamin, Elizabeth's son. Months later, unexpected news brought even more happiness to the family. Elizabeth was pregnant. The arrival of a new member to the family brought everyone involved even closer together. Benjamin and Daniel, excited by the idea of a younger brother or sister, were excited to share this new phase with their mother and father. The mansion, which was once just a symbol of material success and coldness, has transformed into a home full of life, warmth, and love. Alexander, profoundly transformed by Elizabeth's presence and the strength of love that now filled his home, found new purpose in his life. He discovered that true success lay not in material achievements, but in the love he shared with his family. The arrival of the baby brought with it a new chapter, full of hope and promise. Benjamin, who was once a lonely child, became an older brother full of energy, affection, and an immense love for the new life that was to come. Alexander, in turn, rediscovered what really mattered in life. He learned to value human connections and unconditional love. With each passing day, he felt more grateful for the family he had built, and the mansion, which previously only represented financial success, was now the symbol of what really mattered: love, union, and happiness. The family grew and prospered, and life in the mansion became a reflection of this, full of laughter, complicity, and small moments that reminded Alexander that true wealth is not in material possessions, but in the people who share life with us. Alongside Elizabeth and their children, he knew he had found the greatest success of all, a loving home and a bright future to build together. And so, we end our story for today. If you liked it, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any more stories like this. Comment below what you liked most about the story. See you in the next video.